My name is Emma. At 28, I found myself shivering in a snowstorm on the steps of my birthplace, with nothing but a wheezing, aging, golden retriever in my arms. Through the glass windows, bathed in warm, yellow light, I could see my sister raising a glass of champagne, laughing mockingly at her lawyer for finally getting rid of her parasitic younger sister with nothing. She was gloating over having just swallowed our father's $50 million fortune. But what she didn't know was that the will was just a ploy, and the only real $500 million treasure of this family lay peacefully beneath the faded leather of the collar on the dog snuggled against my shirt. Before I tell you the quiet, deliberate steps I took to bring her from a high society queen to bankruptcy and jail in just 30 days, please leave a comment letting me know where you're watching this video from. Like and subscribe if you believe that the insatiable greed of loved ones always comes at a heavy price in blood and tears. Now, let's return to the moment in the will reading room. The lawyer, a man named Davis, whose face was a carefully constructed mask of professional sympathy, cleared his throat. The sound echoed in the tomb-like silence of the conference room. To my eldest daughter, Sarah Thompson, he read, his voice a flat monotone that betrayed no emotion. I bequeath the entirety of Thompson Innovations, including all assets, patents, and controlling shares. My breath hitched, a low, sharp gasp I couldn't swallow back. It felt like a physical blow, a fist of ice slamming into my solar plexus. Thompson Innovations wasn't just a company. It was Dad's life, his legacy. It was the place I'd spent summers organizing files, the place where the smell of machine oil and ozone meant he was nearby. Across the table, Sarah's manicured fingers tightened on her husband Mark's arm. Mark, ever the opportunist, gave her a sleek, predatory grin. They looked like a pair of designer vultures. Davis continued, relentless. I further bequeath to Sarah the family residence at 14 Aspen Ridge, its contents, and the surrounding properties. My childhood home, the sweeping oak staircase I'd tumbled down as a kid, the garden where Mom was buried, the window seat in the library where Dad taught me to read. Each word from the lawyer's mouth was another shovel of dirt on my life. My own throat was closing up. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was as dry as ash. My heart wasn't racing. It was doing the opposite, slowing down. Each beat a heavy, painful thud against my ribs. It's a strange thing the body does when it's under siege. It starts shutting down non-essential systems. Right then, feeling anything felt non-essential. All I could do was watch. Finally, Davis droned on. I bequeath to my daughter Sarah the contents of my personal investment portfolio, held at Morgan Stanley, account number 74B-. He listed the numbers, the current value of which is approximately $50 million. $50 million. The number just hung there in the air, obscene and monstrous. Sarah let out a sound, a little squeak of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. She failed to stifle it, pressing a hand to her mouth as if to trap the glee, but her eyes were blazing. They flickered towards me for a fraction of a second. A flash of pure, venomous triumph. It was the look of a predator that had finally cornered its prey and was savoring the moment before the kill. I didn't react. I couldn't. My entire being was focused on a single, desperate task, not shattering into a million pieces right there on the expensive Persian rug. My hands were clenched so tight in my lap that my nails were cutting crescents into my palms. I could feel the sting, a distant, grounding pain in the fog of unreality. It was the only thing that felt real. Davis adjusted his glasses. A small, almost apologetic gesture. He turned a page of the will, the crisp rustle of the paper sounding like a gunshot in the dead air. And to my youngest daughter, Emma, he said, and for the first time, his voice seemed to carry a sliver of something. Pity, maybe? I held my breath. Perhaps a trust fund, a small annuity, something. A memory of Dad's hand on my head, his voice rumbling. You're my rock. Never forget that. The memory was a knife twisting in my gut. To my youngest daughter, Emma, Davis repeated. I bequeath my loyal companion, Barnaby. He paused. I waited. The room waited, but there was nothing else. Just silence. Thick and suffocating. Barnaby. My father's aging, arthritic, 14-year-old golden retriever. My eyes shot from Davis's impassive face to Sarah's. The dam of her composure broke. A laugh erupted from her, not a giggle, but a loud, ugly, braying sound full of scorn and derision. Mark joined in, a low chuckle that was somehow even more insulting. They were laughing at me, at the sheer, pathetic absurdity of it. The corporate empire, the mansion, the $50 million fortune for her, a dying dog for me. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a final, posthumous slap in the face, orchestrated by my own sister. That's it? Sarah finally managed to gasp out between peals of laughter, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of her perfectly made-up eye. That's all she gets? The mangy old flea bag. She didn't look at me. She addressed the room, as if I were a ghost, an irrelevant footnote in her grand victory. My vision started to tunnel. The edges of the room blurred into a dark gray vignette. The only thing in focus was Sarah's laughing face. It's a primal defense mechanism, I think. When the brain can't process the emotional trauma, it simplifies the input. Fight or flight. My body was screaming flight, but my feet were bolted to the floor. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were floating near the ceiling, watching this tragic little scene play out below. There's a girl who just lost everything. Look at her. She's not even crying. Sarah stood up, her demeanor shifting in an instant from gleeful to ice cold. She was in charge now. Davis, thank you for your services. The reading is concluded. She turned to Mark, then pointed a perfectly polished nail at me. Mark, call security. Have her escorted off the property, immediately. Property. She called our home, the property. Just like that. I was a trespasser. Mark, ever the eager lapdog, was already pulling out his phone. I stood up, my legs feeling like hollow reeds. I didn't say a word. There were no words. What could I say? My silence seemed to infuriate Sarah more than any argument could have. Get out! Emma, she hissed, her voice low and vicious. Take your dog and get out of my house. I turned and walked out of the room, my back straight, not giving them the satisfaction of seeing me run. Each step was a monumental effort of will. As I reached the door, I could hear Davis say, almost a whisper, Sarah, I would advise against. Her sharp reply cut him off. I'm in charge now. Do as I say. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the sound of a final, irrevocable end. Walking through the house for the last time was like walking through a museum of my own life, except all the exhibits were now owned by someone else. The security guards, two large men in ill-fitting suits who usually guarded the front gate, trailed me with awkward sympathy. They'd known me since I was a teenager. One of them, a guy named Frank, wouldn't meet my eyes. He just kept his gaze fixed on a point just over my shoulder. I went to the sunroom, where Barnaby was sleeping on his orthopedic bed, his old body rising and falling with each gentle, wheezing breath. He was the one constant, the one living piece of my father I had left. His tail gave a weak thump, thump, thump against the cushion when he saw me. He tried to stand, his old hips struggling. I knelt down, my knees cracking, and buried my face in his thick, soft fur. It smelled like Dad, like home. For the first time, a tear escaped, hot and sharp, soaking into his coat. It was a tear of pure, gut-wrenching grief, not just for my father, but for the life that had just been ripped away from me. I clipped on his leash. He looked up at me with those soulful, cloudy, brown eyes, questioning. "Come on, boy," I whispered, my voice cracking. "We're going for a walk." I didn't go to my room. I didn't try to pack a bag. Sarah's words echoed in my head, escorted off the property. She wanted to make a point. She wanted to strip me of everything, even my dignity. So I walked out with nothing but the clothes on my back and the dog at my side. Frank, the guard, cleared his throat as I passed the front door. "Miss Emma," he mumbled, "your car keys." He held them out. My simple, 10-year-old Subaru, a gift from Dad on my 21st birthday. I'd forgotten all about it. "She said you can take the car," he added, as if passing on a morsel of royal generosity. "She doesn't want it cluttering up the driveway." Of course, my practical, reliable car wouldn't fit in with the fleet of new Porsches and Maseratis that would soon be parked there. I took the keys, my fingers brushing his. His hand was warm, a small, human connection in a world that had suddenly become hostile and alien. "Thank you, Frank," I said, and my voice sounded surprisingly steady. Barnaby and I walked out into the crisp afternoon air. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to. I helped Barnaby into the passenger seat, his old joints making the climb difficult. He settled down, resting his heavy head on the center console and looking up at me. I got in, started the engine, and pulled out of the long, winding driveway for the last time. As I passed through the wrought iron gates, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I could see Sarah standing on the top step of the grand entrance. A tiny, triumphant figure, silhouetted against the stone facade of the house she now owned. She wasn't watching me leave. She was already on her phone, probably making arrangements for her victory party. I was already forgotten. A piece of trash that had been taken out. The raw, physical shock was beginning to recede, and in its place, a terrifying emptiness bloomed. A black hole where my future used to be. I had no money, no home, no family. Just a tank of gas, a dying dog, and a pain so deep it felt like it had weight and mass, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. The first night was a blur. I drove for hours, aimlessly. The glowing lines on the highway mesmerizing me into a state of numbness. Barnaby slept, his soft snores a comforting rhythm in the crushing silence. I ended up pulling into the parking lot of a place called the Starlight Motel sometime after midnight. The sign was missing the S and the T in Starlight, so it just read Arlight Motel, and the vacancy light flickered with a desperate, anemic buzz. It was perfect. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. The bedspread was a hideous floral pattern, thin and scratchy to the touch. I filled the cheap plastic ice bucket with water for Barnaby and sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, staring at the peeling paint on the walls. The adrenaline of the day had worn off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind was a carousel of horrors, replaying the scene in the lawyer's office. Sarah's cruel laughter. The finality of the front door clicking shut. I had about $300 in my wallet, and maybe another $200 in my checking account. It was grocery money, pocket change, not start your entire life over from scratch money. The reality of my situation began to sink in, cold and heavy as a block of cement. I wasn't just disinherited, I was destitute. I thought about calling friends, but the shame was a physical barrier in my throat. What would I say? "Hey, remember my billionaire father? Well, he died and left me nothing but a dog, and my sister kicked me out. Can I crash on your couch?" The humiliation was too much to bear. Sarah had not only taken my inheritance, she had taken my identity. I was no longer Emma Thompson, daughter of Richard Thompson. I was just Emma, a nobody with a sick dog and a future as bleak and stained as the motel room carpet. I lay down, fully clothed, and pulled the scratchy bedspread over me. Barnaby whimpered in his sleep, his legs twitching as he dreamed. I reached a hand down and stroked his head. His fur was soft under my fingers. He was the only warmth in my new, cold world. The quiet, rhythmic sound of his breathing was the only thing that kept the screaming panic at bay. That night, I didn't dream. It was just a black, empty void, a perfect reflection of my life. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff neck and a clearer head. The fog of shock was lifting, replaced by the sharp, ugly clarity of survival. First things first, Barnaby needed his medication. His arthritis pills weren't cheap, and we both needed to eat. I looked at my reflection in the tarnished mirror above the sink. A pale, hollow-eyed stranger looked back. There was no time for self-pity. Pity doesn't pay for dog food. I spent the next few hours making a plan. It wasn't a grand plan for revenge or justice. It was a plan to make it through the week. I bought the biggest bag of cheap kibble I could find and a few days' worth of groceries for myself. Bread, peanut butter, instant noodles. The cashier at the grocery store gave me a sympathetic look. I probably looked like I'd been sleeping in my car. I had. I drove around until I saw a "Help Wanted" sign in the window of a greasy spoon diner called the Corner Booth. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job. I walked in, filled out an application, and was hired on the spot. My new life had begun. Working at the Corner Booth was a lesson in humility. My days, which used to be filled with managing Dad's schedule, coordinating with his doctors, and reading to him by the fire, were now a blur of refilling coffee cups, wiping up spilled ketchup, and memorizing the difference between a side of fries and a side of home fries. My boss, a perpetually stressed woman named Flo with a heart of gold and a voice like gravel, didn't care that my father's name was on the city's largest hospital wing. She cared if I showed up on time and if I could carry 4 plates without dropping them. My co-workers were a motley crew of lifers, college kids, and people like me, people running from something, or just trying to stay afloat. They didn't ask questions. In a place like the Corner Booth, everyone has a story, and most people are too busy trying to write their own next chapter to read yours. The work was grueling. My feet ached constantly. My back was a permanent knot of tension. I came home, back to the Arlight Motel, smelling of grease and burnt coffee. But there was an odd sort of peace in the exhaustion. It left no room for thinking, no room for remembering. The physical labor was a balm for the mental anguish. The small wad of cash tips in my pocket at the end of a shift was a tangible victory. A small, "I survived another day" trophy. The money went almost entirely to 2 things: the motel room rent, paid weekly in cash, and Barnaby's needs. I bought him a new, thicker orthopedic bed to put on the cold linoleum floor. I bought him the expensive, veterinarian-prescribed food for his sensitive stomach. I'd eat instant noodles for dinner, sitting on the floor next to him, watching him slowly chew his kibble. His presence was a quiet anchor in the storm of my life. When the loneliness threatened to swallow me whole in that sterile little room, I would bury my face in his fur and just breathe. He never judged. He never asked for more than I could give. He just loved me. One evening, after a particularly brutal double shift, I was scrolling through my phone, a habit I was trying to break, and I saw it. A local society blogger had posted photos from Sarah's party. The headline read, "Sarah Thompson ushers in a new era at Thompson Innovations." The pictures were a punch to the gut. There she was, standing in the grand foyer of our home, raising a champagne flute. She was wearing a glittering designer dress that probably cost more than I would make in a year at the diner. Mark was beside her, his arm possessively around her waist, a smug grin plastered on his face. They were surrounded by a crowd of the city's elite, all of them smiling, laughing, celebrating on the grave of my old life. I saw pictures of them in the garden, a marquee set up on the lawn where Mom was buried. They'd hired a famous band. There were ice sculptures. Ice sculptures. I felt a surge of something hot and bitter rise in my throat. It wasn't sadness. It was rage. A cold, pure, diamond-hard rage. I clicked off the phone and stared into the darkness of the motel room. The physical world around me faded. The smell of grease, the ache in my feet, the flickering neon sign outside my window, it all disappeared. In its place, a single, chilling thought began to form. They thought this was over. They thought they had won. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The rage didn't burn out. It settled. It cooled and solidified into something heavy and permanent in the pit of my stomach. It became a source of fuel. Waking up for a 6 a.m. shift was easier when I pictured Sarah's smiling face. Dealing with a rude customer was nothing compared to the memory of her laughter in that office. The grueling, mindless work became a kind of meditation. It freed up my mind to think, to analyze, to plan. My father didn't raise a fool. He taught me to play chess when I was 6. He taught me that you don't win by attacking wildly. You win by seeing the whole board, by anticipating your opponent's moves, by sacrificing a pawn to take a queen. Sarah had made her move. She'd taken my queen, my king, my entire side of the board, and she thought the game was over. But she'd forgotten about one small, seemingly insignificant piece she'd left me. A pawn. The old, gray-muzzled pawn, currently snoring softly at the foot of my bed. I started observing. I became a ghost. During my breaks at the diner, I'd use the public library's computer to scan business journals and financial news sites, searching for any mention of Thomson Innovations. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Sarah was moving fast, too fast. The headlines spoke of a bold new direction and aggressive restructuring. I knew what that meant. She was firing people, not just redundant middle managers, but loyal, long-time employees, people who had been with my father for decades. I saw a quote from a grim-faced union representative. The new leadership seems more interested in liquidating assets than in building a future. Liquidating assets. She was planning to sell the company off in pieces, strip it for parts like a stolen car. It made no sense. Why would she destroy the golden goose? Unless she needed cash. A lot of it. Fast. The thought lodged in my brain like a splinter. Sarah and Mark lived extravagantly. But they lived on Mark's modest salary as a wealth manager and Sarah's allowance. Dad was generous, but he wasn't stupid. He never gave them control of any serious money. So how were they funding their jet-set lifestyle? The designer clothes? The sports cars? How had they afforded the down payment on that disastrous glass and steel monstrosity of a condo they'd bought downtown during the last real estate boom? The one the market promptly crashed out from under? I remembered Dad ranting about it one night. Leverage to the hilt, he'd grumbled. That boy Mark thinks debt is a 4-letter word for opportunity. A seed of an idea began to sprout in the dark soil of my anger. What if they were in trouble? Not just overextended trouble, but deep, drowning in red ink trouble. What if the $50 million wasn't a prize? What if it was a lifeline they desperately needed? And what if, just what if, my father knew it? He saw everything. He always did. He was the best chess player I ever knew. life settled into a strange, bifurcated rhythm. There was Diner Emma, who smiled and poured coffee and worried about making rent. Then there was the other Emma, the one who emerged late at night in the quiet of the motel room. That Emma was a hunter. She spent hours online, falling down rabbit holes of public records, property deeds, and court filings. It was amazing what you could find if you knew where to look. I traced the ownership of Sarah and Mark's condo. They'd bought it through a shell LLC, a common tactic for the wealthy. But I found the mortgage documents. They were leveraged to the absolute maximum. They'd taken out a second, private mortgage with an interest rate that was nothing short of predatory. They were paying a fortune every month just to keep their heads above water. Then I found the lawsuits. Small claims court at first, a high-end caterer suing for an unpaid bill from a party, a custom tailor for a dozen of Mark's suits, then bigger ones, an art gallery, a dealer of rare wines. It was a clear pattern of people living far beyond their means, using their association with my father to get credit. And then slow-paying everyone. They were juggling debt, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and putting on a flawless performance for the world. My sister, the socialite, my brother-in-law, the financial guru. It was all a lie, a fragile, glittering house of cards. And my father's death had been the gale force wind they were counting on to either blow it all away or provide them with enough cash to reinforce it forever. I started to think about my father in those last few months. His mind had been sharp, but the illness had made him quiet, withdrawn. Or so I thought. What if it wasn't withdrawal? What if it was observation? He was watching, listening. Sarah would visit, her voice dripping with fake sympathy, complaining about how much work the estate would be to manage, subtly poisoning him against me. Emma is so simple, Daddy. I once overheard her saying from the hallway. She doesn't have the head for business. She wouldn't know what to do with all this. And my dad had just grunted, a non-committal sound. I'd thought he was just tired. Now, I wondered. Was he playing the part of a befuddled old man? Was he letting her think she was in control? Giving her just enough rope to hang herself? The idea was both terrifying and thrilling. The thought that my quiet, gentle father might have been orchestrating a final, brilliant chess move from his deathbed sent a shiver down my spine. It was a cold comfort, but it was comfort nonetheless. It meant I wasn't alone in this. It meant the game wasn't over. It was my turn to move. But what was my move? I had the motive, the theory, but I had no proof. Nothing but a sick old dog and a pocket full of tips. It was a Tuesday, 29 days since the will reading. The sky was the color of a dirty dish rag, and a miserable, soaking rain was falling. It was my day off, and I'd spent most of it trying to fix the leaking faucet in the motel bathroom with a wrench I'd borrowed from the front desk. My knuckles were scraped, and I was soaked. It was a perfect metaphor for my life. I was sitting on the floor, sharing a bag of stale crackers with Barnaby, when there was a knock on the door, a sharp, authoritative rap, not the hesitant tap of a maid or the clumsy thud of a lost tourist. My first thought was that it was the motel manager, come to tell me my weekly rent was late, even though it wasn't. I wiped my greasy hands on my jeans and opened the door a crack. Standing under the leaky overhang, holding a large black umbrella, was Mr. Davis, my father's lawyer. He looked profoundly out of place. His immaculate gray suit and polished leather shoes were an affront to the peeling paint and cracked concrete of the Starlight Motel. He looked older than he had a month ago, his face etched with new lines of weariness. His eyes, when they met mine, held that same unreadable, professional calm. But there was something else there, too, a flicker of urgency. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Emma." May I come in? I was too stunned to speak. I just stepped back, holding the door open. He stepped inside, his umbrella dripping onto the already stained carpet. He took in the tiny, grim room with a single, sweeping glance. The unmade bed, the hot plate on the rickety table, the dog bed in the corner, and his expression didn't change. But I saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. He turned to me. I need to speak with you. It is a matter of the utmost importance. My heart started that slow, heavy thudding again. Is something wrong? I asked, my voice raspy. Is it about Sarah? In a way, he said, his gaze dropping to Barnaby, who had gotten to his feet and was sniffing cautiously at the lawyer's expensive trousers. Barnaby rarely stood for strangers, but he seemed calm, almost curious. It's about your father's final instructions. He paused, choosing his words with deliberate care. There were certain conditions and timelines stipulated in his private directives to me. A waiting period, to be precise. That period has now expired. A waiting period? My mind raced. What was he talking about? I don't understand, I said. The will was clear. Sarah gets everything. I get the dog. Davis gave a small, sad sigh. The public will. Yes, that document is legally sound and has been executed as written. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his professional facade, a glint of something that looked like respect. Your father was a very complex man, Emma. He was also a very good judge of character. He foresaw a number of potential outcomes. He gestured towards Barnaby. How has he been? The question was so unexpected, so mundane, that it threw me off balance. He's old, I stammered. His hips are bad, but he's a good boy. Davis nodded slowly. Your father loved that dog very much. He said Barnaby was the most loyal soul he'd ever known. He looked from Barnaby back to me. And he trusted you to care for him. That was the most important thing. It was the key. I stared at him, my confusion mounting. The key? The key to what? My life savings were dwindling to nothing. I was a waitress living in a roach-infested motel. What key could I possibly hold? Davis took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the old, worn leather collar around Barnaby's neck. It was the same collar he'd worn for years. The leather was cracked and faded, the metal nameplate tarnished. May I? He asked, gesturing toward the dog. I nodded, still bewildered. Davis knelt down, a motion that seemed unnatural in his stiff, expensive suit. Barnaby, instead of shying away, rested his head on the lawyer's knee and let out a soft sigh. Davis ran a gentle hand over the dog's back before his fingers found the collar. Your father was a brilliant engineer in his youth, you know, he said conversationally, his fingers probing the thickest part of the leather. He loved puzzles, miniaturization. He always believed the best hiding place was in plain sight. With a deft movement, his thumbnail found a nearly invisible seam in the leather. He slid it along the edge, and a small section of the collar, no bigger than my thumb, popped open. It wasn't just leather. It was a cleverly disguised housing. Inside, nestled in a tiny, custom-cut foam bed, was a minuscule memory card, a micro SD card. My jaw went slack. I stared at the tiny black square, glinting under the dim motel room light. It looked so impossibly small, so insignificant. Davis carefully plucked it out with his fingertips and held it in the palm of his hand. This, he said, his voice barely a whisper, is your father's true last will and testament. I couldn't process it. My brain was short-circuiting. A memory card, hidden in a dog collar. It was something out of a spy movie, not my life. But What about the will? The one you read? I asked, the words tumbling out. Was it fake? Not at all, Davis said, standing up. It was a perfectly legal, binding document designed to do exactly what it did. Give Sarah the rope. Your father suspected she and her husband were in financial trouble. He knew they were bleeding the company accounts with creative expenses. He wanted to see what she would do if she thought she had unlimited power and resources. He gave her a loaded gun to see if she would shoot herself with it. And she did. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, slim envelope. He handed it to me. My name was written on the front in my father's familiar, spiky handwriting. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was not a letter, but a single, heavy piece of cardstock. Printed on it was a long, complex string of alphanumeric characters, a password. The card contains a video statement from your father, recorded 2 weeks before he passed, Davis explained. It also contains encrypted financial documents, emails, and spreadsheets. Evidence. The password on that card is the decryption key. It will only work once, on one specific terminal. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. There is a meeting of the board of directors of Thomson Innovations scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Sarah has called it. The agenda is to approve the piecemeal sale of the company's most profitable divisions to a private equity firm. A firm, I might add, that public records show has a very cozy relationship with her husband, Mark. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. They weren't just taking the money. They were gutting the company, cashing out, and running. You need to be at that meeting. Emma, Davis said, his voice now steel. You need to plug this into the boardroom's main computer. That is the terminal. When you enter the password, everything will be revealed. He looked at me, his face grim. Your father's game is over. It's time to checkmate. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The small motel room, which had been my prison and my sanctuary for a month, now felt like a command center on the eve of battle. I held the tiny memory card in my hand, feeling the weight of it, the impossible density of its potential. It was a bomb, a digital hand grenade, and tomorrow. I was going to walk into the heart of the enemy's camp and pull the pin. Barnaby seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. He didn't settle down on his bed, but lay with his head on my lap, his warm, heavy presence, a constant source of comfort. I stroked his soft ears, my fingers tracing the outline of the now empty secret compartment in his collar. You're a good boy, I whispered to him over and over. You're the best boy. He had been my inheritance, and it turned out he was the most valuable thing my father owned. My fear was a living thing, a cold knot of dread in my stomach. What if it didn't work? What if Sarah's security threw me out before I could even get to the boardroom? What if the password was wrong, or the files were corrupted? The what-ifs were an army, laying siege to my resolve. But then I would picture Sarah's face, twisted with mocking laughter. I would hear her voice, dripping with contempt, as she ordered me out of my own home, and the fear would recede, replaced by that cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just about the money or the company anymore. This was about my father's legacy. It was about the decades of his life he had poured into building something of value, something Sarah was about to sell for scrap to cover her gambling debts. It was about the loyal employees she'd thrown away like trash. It was about justice, a concept I was beginning to realize had very little to do with courtrooms and everything to do with consequences. I didn't have a power suit or designer shoes. My uniform for the next day would be the same clean but worn-out jeans and simple black sweater I'd been living in. My armor would be the truth. My weapon would be a piece of plastic and silicone no bigger than a fingernail. I rehearsed the plan in my head 100 times, I would walk in. I would act calm. Davis had told me he would be there, that, as the executor of the estate, he had a right to attend. He would get me in the room. The rest was up to me. I thought about the girl who had walked out of that lawyer's office 30 days ago, broken, lost, and utterly defeated. She wouldn't be the one walking into the boardroom tomorrow. That girl was gone. In her place was someone new, someone colder, harder, and more focused than I ever thought I could be. I wasn't the grieving daughter anymore. I wasn't the humble waitress. I was my father's daughter, and I was coming to finish the game he had started. The West remembers, I thought. A phrase Dad used to say when talking about old debts. The sun was just beginning to stain the gray sky with a faint blush of pink when I finally fell into a restless, dreamless sleep. The memory card clutched safely in my fist. The next morning, I drove my beat-up Subaru not to the diner, but downtown. I parked in a public garage 3 blocks away from the gleaming steel and glass monument that was Thompson Tower. The building loomed over the city, my father's name etched in massive chrome letters above the entrance. It used to feel like a second home. Today, it felt like enemy territory. I walked the 3 blocks in the cold morning air, the memory card a tiny, hard square in my pocket, a talisman against the fear coiling in my gut. My reflection in the polished glass doors was a joke, a woman in cheap jeans and a frayed sweater about to walk into a den of wolves in bespoke suits. I pushed the door open. The lobby was a cathedral of corporate power, marble floors so polished you could see your soul in them, a ceiling 3 stories high, and a hushed, reverent silence broken only by the soft clicks of expensive shoes. The air smelled of money and ambition. The security guard at the main desk, a new guy I didn't recognize, looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my worn-out boots. His lip curled into a barely concealed sneer. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone making it clear he thought I was a delivery person or a lost tourist. "I'm here for the board meeting," I said, my voice even, betraying none of the tremor I felt inside. He raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Name? Emma Thompson." His fingers tapped on his keyboard. His expression shifted from disdain to confusion, then to a flicker of recognition. A memo had clearly gone out. My name was on a list, but probably not the one he expected. Yes, Miss Thompson. They're on the 40th floor. The executive boardroom." He gestured stiffly towards the elevator bank. He didn't offer to badge me through. He just watched me, his suspicion warring with his duty. As I walked towards the elevators, I felt hundreds of eyes on me. The well-dressed men and women crisscrossing the lobby all slowed, their gazes sliding over me with curiosity and contempt. I was an anomaly, a glitch in their perfect, ordered world. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. As the doors slid shut, sealing me in the mirrored box, I caught my reflection again. The fear was still there, a shadow in my eyes, but behind it, something else was hardening, something cold and clear as ice. The ascent was silent, my ears popping as we rose. 38, 39, 40. The doors opened onto a silent, plushly carpeted hallway. At the far end was a set of massive, dark wood doors. The boardroom. Davis was waiting for me, standing off to one side, his face a perfect neutral mask. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the reassurance I needed. I took a deep breath, the conditioned air feeling thin and sterile in my lungs. My hand was steady as I reached for the handle. Showtime. I pushed the doors open and walked in. The room fell silent. It was as if someone had hit a mute button. 12 pairs of eyes, belonging to the most powerful people in the company, all swiveled to face me. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered it. A long, intimidating slab of polished mahogany, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a godlike view of the city below, and the faint, expensive smell of leather and wood polish. Sarah was sitting at the head of the table, the position that had always been my father's. She was in her element, wearing a sharp, blood-red power suit, a stark contrast to my drab black sweater. When she saw me, her face went through a rapid series of micro-expressions: shock, confusion, and then a wave of pure, unadulterated fury. Her eyes narrowed to slits. "What the hell are you doing here?" she spat, her voice cutting through the silence like a shard of glass. Mark, sitting at her right hand, looked equally stunned, his mouth slightly agape. He looked like a fish that had just been slapped onto the deck of a boat. The other board members? Old men my father had known for years, and a few new faces Sarah had appointed. Just stared, their expressions ranging from bewildered to annoyed. I ignored them all, my focus entirely on my sister. I didn't answer her. Instead, I started walking slowly, deliberately, along the side of the long table. My worn boots were silent on the thick carpet. The only sound was the frantic, angry tapping of Sarah's pen against a leather-bound notepad. "Security!" she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch. "Someone get security up here now! Get her out!" Mark fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking slightly. "You are trespassing," he said, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. His voice was thin, reedy. I kept walking, my gaze locked with Sarah's. I saw the panic starting to bubble behind the anger in her eyes. She wasn't in control, and it was driving her insane. I reached the head of the table. "You have no right to be in this room," she hissed, her face flushed a blotchy red that clashed with her suit. "This is a private meeting." "I believe she does have a right," a calm voice said from the doorway. Mr. Davis stepped into the room, closing the heavy doors behind him with a soft but definitive click. "As the executor of Richard Thompson's estate, I am here to oversee the execution of his final wishes. And so," he paused, looking directly at me. "Is she—" Sarah's head snapped towards Davis, her mouth opening and closing silently. She was cornered. She had no legal grounds to throw him out, and he had just given me a shield of legitimacy. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances. The corporate coup they had been expecting was suddenly turning into a bizarre family soap opera. "This is outrageous," Sarah finally managed, finding her voice. "This has nothing to do with the estate. This is a corporate matter." "On the contrary," Davis said smoothly, "it has everything to do with the estate." I took the final step, standing directly beside the large, integrated computer monitor at the head of the table. My hand went into my pocket. My fingers closed around the memory card. The final piece in my father's game. My movements were slow, precise. I pulled the memory card from my pocket. It looked ridiculously small in the cavernous, important room. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger. Sarah stared at it, her brows furrowed in confusion. It meant nothing to her. For a moment, she seemed to think it was some kind of pathetic joke. "What is that?" she sneered. "Your bus pass?" I didn't grace her with an answer. I leaned forward, my body shielding my movements, and found the USB-C port on the side of the sleek monitor. I slid the tiny card into a small adapter I'd bought for $10 at a convenience store that morning, and then plugged the adapter into the port. A small LED on the adapter blinked once, a tiny green heartbeat. On the massive screen that dominated the wall, a new drive icon appeared. The room was utterly silent now. The tapping of Sarah's pen had stopped. Even her breathing seemed to have ceased. The board members were leaning forward, their curiosity overriding their corporate decorum. This was better than any quarterly report. "Whatever this is, it's a pathetic, desperate stunt," Mark blustered, trying to regain some semblance of control. He stood up, knocking his chair back slightly. I'm calling security myself. He started to walk around the table towards me. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Mark, Davis said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. Mark froze, halfway between his seat and me. I used the wireless mouse to click on the new drive. A single password prompt box appeared on the screen. Stark and white. Enter decryption. Key. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could feel Sarah's hatred boring into my back. I could feel the collective, anxious gaze of the entire room. My own heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The point of no return. I pulled the heavy cardstock from my pocket, the one with my father's handwriting, and placed it on the table, with methodical, deliberate keystrokes. I typed the long, complex code. Each click of the keys echoed in the silent room. I hit enter. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The password box just stared back at me. A triumphant, vicious smile started to spread across Sarah's face. She opened her mouth to speak, to declare my ultimate failure. And then the screen went black. A collective gasp went through the room. A woman on the far side of the table actually yelped. The blackness held for a moment, and then it was replaced by a face. My father's face. Not the sick, gaunt man from the end, but the man from a year ago. His eyes were clear, sharp, and radiating an intensity that seemed to reach out from the screen and grab you by the throat. He was sitting in his favorite leather chair in the library, the fireplace crackling behind him. He looked directly into the camera, as if he were looking directly at each and every one of us. Hello, Sarah, he said, and his voice, full of its old power and resonance, filled the room. Sarah made a small, strangled sound in the back of her throat and sank back into her chair as if she'd been punched. My father on the screen leaned forward slightly, a gesture I knew meant he was getting to the heart of a matter. If you are watching this, he said, his voice a low, controlled rumble. It means two things. 1, I am dead. And 2, my daughter Emma has done as I asked. His eyes seemed to find me, even through the lens of the camera. Thank you, my girl. You were always the strong one. Then his gaze shifted, hardening as he looked back into the camera, as if staring straight at my sister. Sarah, we need to talk about your finances. Mark flinched as if he'd been struck. Sarah went rigid, her face turning the color of chalk. I am not a fool, my father continued. I was never a fool. Did you really think I didn't see the shell corporations? Mark? The consulting fees paid to companies you secretly owned? Did you think I didn't notice the millions being siphoned from the marketing budget to cover your disastrous real estate bets? On the screen, a series of documents flashed up next to my father's head. Bank statements, wire transfers, damning emails between Sarah and Mark. It was all there, laid out in cold, hard, undeniable detail. The board members were murmuring now, leaning towards each other, whispering in shocked tones. The air in the room was thick with scandal. You were drowning in debt, my father's voice boomed, a fact you took great pains to hide. You were desperate. So I decided to conduct a little experiment. I decided to give you exactly what you thought you wanted. He smiled then, but it was a terrifying sight. It was the smile of a predator that has enjoyed watching its prey walk nonchalantly into a steel trap. That $50 million I left you in the will, the portfolio, the properties, it was a beautiful package, wasn't it? A golden lifeline. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. There's just one small detail I omitted from the will. A week before I recorded this, I took out a single, consolidated loan against every one of those assets. I leveraged it all: the house, the stocks, the art, every last penny. The loan was structured with a 30-day grace period following my death, after which the entire principal is due, in full, immediately. He glanced at an imaginary watch on his wrist. That should be right about now. As if on cue, Mark's phone, which was sitting on the table, began to buzz violently. The caller ID was visible to everyone sitting near him: Blackwood Capital, the private bank that held the deadliest corporate debt. Mark stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. "So you see, Sarah," my father said, his voice softening to a tone of mock sympathy, "I didn't leave you a $50 million fortune. I left you a $50 million debt, and the bank is coming to collect." Sarah finally broke. A raw, ragged sob tore from her throat. Her perfect, composed world had just been detonated, and she was standing at ground zero. The image of the buzzing phone was seared into my brain. Mark, pale and sweating, finally silenced it, his hand trembling so badly he almost knocked over his water glass. On the screen, my father watched the chaos he had wrought with a calm, almost serene expression. The board members were in an uproar, shouting questions at Davis, who remained impassive. Sarah was just sobbing, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "But that," my father's voice cut through the noise, silencing the room once more, "is just housekeeping, clearing away the garbage. It's not about my legacy." He leaned back in his chair. "My legacy is not a house or a stock portfolio. It is Thompson Innovations. It is the work of my life and the lives of the thousands of loyal people who helped me build it. And I will not have it stripped for parts by a greedy, short-sighted fool and her parasitic husband." The insult hit Sarah like a physical blow. She looked up, her face a mess of tears and smeared mascara, her eyes full of a dawning, horrifying understanding. "I knew you would try to sell it," he said simply. "It's what desperate people do. So I took steps to protect it. I spent the last 6 months of my life quietly restructuring my personal holdings." A new series of documents appeared on the screen. Legal charters, incorporation papers for a trust fund so airtight it would make a pharaoh's tomb look leaky. The vast majority of my personal wealth, approximately $500 million in liquid assets, was transferred into this trust, he explained. Furthermore, I converted my 70% controlling stake in Thompson Innovations into non-public, preferred voting shares. Those shares were also placed into the trust. One of the older board members, a man named George, who had been my father's friend for 40 years, gasped audibly. "This trust," my father continued, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper, "is anonymous. It is shielded. It is, for all intents and purposes, invisible. And it is controlled by a single, sole trustee, a person with absolute and irrevocable authority over all its assets, including the controlling shares of this company." The room held its breath. Every person was leaning forward, desperate to hear the name. Sarah stared at the screen, a wild, desperate hope flickering in her eyes. Did she really think, even after all this, it could be her? "The trustee," my father said, his eyes finding the camera again, finding me, "is the one person I knew I could count on. The one person who loved me not for my money, but for myself. The one who was there, holding my hand, until the very end." He paused for dramatic effect. "The master showman to the last. The sole trustee of the Thompson Legacy Trust," he declared, his voice ringing with pride and finality, "is my daughter, Emma." He held up a document to the camera, the final page of the trust agreement. His signature was a bold, angry slash at the bottom. And below it, the line for the access key was filled in with a long string of numbers. The numbers that had been engraved on a small metal tag. The numbers that had been hanging around Barnaby's neck for the last 5 years. The video ended. The screen went black for 5 full seconds. The only sound in the room was the hum of the air conditioning. It was a silence so profound, so heavy. It felt like a physical pressure. Then the dam broke. Sarah launched herself out of her chair. It wasn't a cry of anger or a sob of grief. It was an animal sound, a raw, guttural shriek of pure, uncomprehending rage. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking, shredding. "Lies! It's all lies. He was a senile old fool. She manipulated him. She poisoned him against me." Her eyes, wild and bloodshot, fixed on me. They were no longer the eyes of a triumphant sister, but of a cornered animal. The mask of sophistication was gone, ripped away to reveal the ugly, grasping desperation beneath. "You!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "You did this! You little bitch! You were always jealous, always skulking in the shadows." She lunged across the corner of the table, clawing at me. Her perfectly manicured nails transformed into talons. Mark and one of the other board members grabbed her, pulling her back. She fought them, thrashing like a wild thing, her expensive suit twisting, a seam in the shoulder ripping with a soft tearing sound. "It's mine!" she screamed, her voice dissolving into hysterical sobs. "He promised me. It was always supposed to be mine." Mark was trying to calm her, his own face a mask of waxy, sweaty terror. Sarah, calm down. We'll fight this," he stammered, but his words were hollow. He knew. He was a numbers guy. He knew they were finished. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw it all. The pleading, the terror, the hatred. He was looking at the person who held the key to his prison cell. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just stood there and watched her implode. This was the part I hadn't planned for. The part my father's video hadn't shown me. The raw, messy, human fallout. I felt a strange and unsettling calm settle over me. The brain has a finite capacity for shock. Mine had hit its limit a month ago. What I was feeling now was quiet. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the bomb has fallen. I looked around the room. The board members were a mixture of horrified and fascinated. They were witnessing the spectacular self-immolation of the woman who, 5 minutes earlier, had been their undisputed queen. "Mr. Davis stepped forward, his face grim. "Sarah, I think it's time for you to leave." That was the final insult. Being dismissed in her own boardroom. She let out one last, ragged wail and finally collapsed, sobbing, into Mark's arms. He started guiding her towards the door, his own movements wooden, robotic. As they passed me, her head lifted, and she gave me one last look of pure, undiluted venom. It was a look that promised a lifetime of hate. I met her gaze and held it, my expression unreadable. I didn't have to say a word. The silence was my victory. As the boardroom doors closed behind Sarah and Mark, a wave of chaotic energy filled the room. The board members all started talking at once, their voices a confused babble of legal jargon, financial questions, and stunned disbelief. I let them talk for a full minute, letting the pressure build. Then I cleared my throat. It wasn't a loud sound, but in the charged atmosphere, it cut through the noise like a bell. The room fell silent again, and all eyes turned to me. They were looking at me differently now. The pity, the contempt, the confusion, it was all gone, replaced by a potent cocktail of fear, respect, and avarice. I was no longer the pathetic little sister. I was the 70% majority shareholder. I was the power in the room. "Gentlemen," I said, and my voice came out stronger and steadier than I thought it would. "My first order of business as the controlling party of this company is to formally and permanently cancel the proposed sale of the aerospace and technology divisions." I looked directly at the two board members Sarah had appointed, men with known ties to the private equity firm. "The motion is dead," one of them started to bluster. "Now see here, young lady, you can't just—" "I can," I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave, taking on a cold edge I didn't know I possessed. "And I have. It's done." I turned my attention to George, my father's old friend. His face was pale, but his eyes were shining with a look of fierce, dawning hope. "George," I said, "my father trusted you. He said you were the last honest man on this board. Is that true?" He swallowed hard and nodded. "I'd like to think so. Emma." "Good," I said. "Then my second order of business is to nominate you as interim chairman of the board, effective immediately. All in favor?" I raised my own hand. After a moment's hesitation, the other original board members raised theirs. The two new appointees sat stone-faced, their short-lived reign of power evaporating before their eyes. "My third order of business," I continued, pressing my advantage, "is to reinstate Frank Peterson as Chief Financial Officer. I want him back in his office by noon today, with a 20% salary increase and a formal apology from this board for his wrongful termination." There was a stunned silence. Frank Peterson was a brilliant bulldog of a CFO, a man of unimpeachable integrity whom Sarah had fired in her first week because he'd refused to sign off on her and Mark's outrageous expense reports. Reinstating him was a clear signal. The party was over. The era of corruption had ended. Davis, who had been watching silently, stepped forward and placed a thin, leather-bound folder on the table in front of me. "The legal documents confirming your position as trustee and your voting authority are all here," he said calmly. "Everything is in order." The power shift was no longer theoretical. It was a documented, legally binding fact. I looked down the long mahogany table at the faces of these powerful men, and for the first time in a month, I wasn't afraid. I was in charge. The foundations of Sarah's world didn't just crack. They vaporized. The chain reaction my father had set in motion was faster and more brutal than I could have imagined. As the board meeting was breaking up, George, the new chairman, was approached by his assistant, her face pale. "Mr. Henderson," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "There are two gentlemen in the lobby from the FBI. They have a warrant. They're asking for all financial records pertaining to Mark and Sarah Thompson from the last 5 years." A chill went through the room. My father hadn't just left a video. The encrypted files on that memory card contained a meticulously documented case file of their fraud. Every illegal transfer, every forged invoice, every lie. He hadn't just disinherited them. He'd handed them over to the federal government on a silver platter. At the same time, one of the other board members was looking at his phone, his eyes wide. "My God," he breathed. "It's on the financial newswires already. Blackwood Capital has filed for an immediate seizure of all assets listed as collateral on the Thompson-Markham loan." He read from the screen. "The Aspen Ridge Estate, a portfolio of securities, a collection of modern art." It was all gone. Or rather, it was never theirs to begin with. The bank, as instructed, had moved with lightning speed. While Sarah had been screaming at me, foreclosure notices were being filed and seizure orders were being executed. The $50 million trap had snapped shut with brutal efficiency. I left them to deal with the fallout. I didn't want to see it. My part was done. As I rode the elevator down, I felt a profound sense of exhaustion, as if I'd been holding my breath for 30 days and had only just exhaled. When the doors opened onto the main lobby, it was a scene of controlled chaos. Two quiet, serious-looking men in dark suits, the FBI agents, were speaking with the head of security. Across the lobby, I saw them. Sarah and Mark. They were standing near the doors, but they weren't leaving. Two uniformed bank officers and a man in a legal-looking suit were speaking to them in low, firm tones. Sarah was shaking her head, a look of numb disbelief on her face. Mark was just staring into space, his face ashen. He looked like a man who had already been convicted and sentenced. They were trapped. They couldn't go back to a home that was being seized. Their bank accounts, as I would later learn, had been frozen. The credit cards in their wallets were now useless pieces of plastic. In the space of a single hour, they had gone from the pinnacle of society to utterly destitute. They had nothing, less than nothing. They had my father's $50 million debt. As I walked past, Sarah's eyes met mine. The fire was gone. The hate was gone. There was nothing left but a hollow, empty void. She was a ghost, haunted by the life she had just lost. I kept walking and didn't look back. The drive back to my father's house, my house, was surreal. The same route I'd driven a month ago in a fog of grief and shock. I now drove with a strange sense of detachment. The anger was gone. The burning need for revenge had been satisfied. All that was left was a quiet, echoing emptiness. I pulled the Subaru through the large iron gates, which now felt welcoming instead of forbidding. I parked not in front of the grand entrance, but around the side, near the kitchen, where I always used to park. I helped Barnaby out of the car. His old legs were stiff, but he seemed to know where he was. His tail gave a few hopeful, thumping wags. He sniffed the air, a long, deep inhale of familiar smells. Home. I unlocked the side door, and we stepped inside. The house was cavernously quiet. The army of caterers and party planners was gone. The faint, cloying scent of Sarah's expensive perfume still lingered in the air, a ghostly reminder of her brief, disastrous reign. I walked through the silent rooms. Everything was exactly as she had left it. A half-empty champagne glass here, a discarded fashion magazine there. It felt like walking through a Marie Celeste of personal ambition. A ship found, abandoned, its crew having vanished in an instant. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt sad. Sad for the waste. Sad for the sister I once had. The person she used to be before greed and envy consumed her. I walked out into the garden, Barnaby trotting happily, if a bit slowly, beside me. I stood by my mother's grave for a long time. The marquee was gone, but the lawn was still trampled and muddy in places from the party. "It's over, Mom," I whispered to the quiet stone marker. "It's all over." I went back inside, and my first act as the new owner of this vast, empty mansion was to find Barnaby's old, familiar water bowl. It had been tossed in a corner of the laundry room. I washed it, filled it with fresh, cold water, and set it down in its usual spot by the kitchen door. Barnaby drank noisily, his tags clinking against the ceramic. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of order being restored. That night, I didn't sleep in the master bedroom. I slept in my old childhood room. And as I lay in the dark, listening to the old house groan and settle around me, with Barnaby snoring softly on the rug beside my bed, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a survivor. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt a fragile, tentative flicker of peace. The war was over. Now, the long work of rebuilding could begin. It's been 6 months. The headlines have faded. Sarah and Mark pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges to avoid a longer, more public trial. They lost everything. The house, the cars, the reputation. They exist now only as a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. Mark is serving a 3-year sentence in a low-security federal prison. Sarah got 2 years probation, thanks to a high-priced lawyer who argued she was merely a pawn in her husband's schemes. The ultimate betrayal. For him, I'm sure. She lives in a small, rented apartment on the other side of the country. We don't speak. There's nothing left to say. My revenge wasn't loud or violent. I never raised my voice. I never had to. I simply opened a door my father had unlocked and allowed the consequences of their own actions to rush in and sweep them away. The most profound victory isn't in destroying your enemy, but in watching them destroy themselves with the very tools they tried to use against you. Thompson Innovations is thriving. I brought back my father's entire old team, starting with Frank Peterson and George Henderson. We're not just a company, we're a family again. We're building things, creating, honoring the legacy my father truly cared about. I don't run the day-to-day operations. I found people smarter than me for that. I'm the guardian, the shepherd of his life's work. The house is no longer a silent museum. It's a home. I have friends over for dinner. The sound of laughter echoes in the halls again. And Barnaby, my sweet, loyal Barnaby, lived for another 5 happy months. He spent his last days sleeping in sunbeams on his favorite Persian rug. His belly full, surrounded by love. He passed away, peacefully, in his sleep. His collar, the key that changed everything, sits on the mantelpiece in the library. It's a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't hidden in a vault, but are right beside you, offering their quiet, unconditional loyalty all along. I was stripped of everything, and in that nothingness, I found out who I truly was. They thought they were burying a victim, but they didn't realize they were planting a seed. My story isn't about the money. It's about the fact that your worth is not determined by what others take from you, but by what you refuse to surrender. They can take your home, your money, your name, but they can never take your integrity or your strength unless you let them. What's the one thing in your life that you would refuse to let anyone take from you? And what have you learned from the biggest betrayal you've ever faced? Let me know in the comments below. Your stories give us all strength.